we're outside the wall, and today I'm here with Wally and Evildex.
Bonjour.
Hello, and today we'll be talking about the 12 Tasks of Asterix, and this is a 1976 animated movie based on the Asterix the Gaul comic. This was directed by, well, actually has two of the co-directors as the original creators, Rene Goscinny and Alberto Derso. Derso just recently passed away, so we actually moved this movie up in our timeline because of it. The other ones being Henry Gruel and Pierre Waltrin as their directors. And we're going to start with Walt's opinion on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't hate this movie, but to me, it very much felt like a Saturday morning cartoon type of thing, which I definitely think was the intent for it. I know this is something that was very popular in France, in particular, because it happens to whack at the Romans, who are essentially the Italians in this a lot. I think it was also fairly popular in England for a time too, because I know there was an English dub for this show as a whole. But overall, I mean, it was okay. It's nothing that I think stands out as far as animation nor story nor characters. It's very much kind of popcorn chewing, have fun with the kids type of thing. And I mean, there was a bit of humor in it for me that at least I don't know. I think it was just okay at best.
Okay, I guess we'll go on to me then. So this is actually the second French animation that I've seen. The first one was called The Old Woman and the Pigeons, and my reaction to that can basically be summarized as French people are weird. But in contrast to this, that I think Asterix will come off as quite familiar to American audiences who are used to things like Looney Tunes, which it particularly reminds me of. You can see an echo of Bugs Bunny outsmarting Elmer Fudd in the way that Asterix and Caesar interact. Caesar's kind of like the natural predator of the Gaul, as you could say, and is being made a fool of by this witty cartoon character in Asterix. So that was kind of it was not there's nothing wrong with that dynamic, but it is something that a lot of us will have seen before. In terms of animation, it's a little bit visibly lower budget compared to a lot of other things, including something like Animaniacs would be a tough example for it to compare to, both because it's older and French, probably, which means they don't have quite the same amount of resources in American production. So it doesn't have as many clever visual gags or um, particularly exciting uses of animation compared to something like Animaniacs. But one sequence that I would like to call attention to, that was probably my favorite part of the movie, is when Asterix and his friends have to navigate a large bureaucratic building. That kind of had a bit of a, I guess you could almost say, satirical sense of humor to it, and was kind of more fun scene for the adult audience, I guess. Overall, I think this is like a 3 out of 5 sort of movie. So not something that you're ever gonna remember till the day you die, but as the time, okay.
Okay, so for me, this is actually, I believe I saw all of the Asterix animated movies when I was a kid. I saw a bit of others throughout the years. Again, like this one is, I think, arguably my favorite from the ones I rewatched. The other ones being Asterix and Cleopatra, that I can remember. And I think I had the most fun with this. It will like say it's because of nostalgia factor, and maybe right about that. I have a more dear spot for Asterix and Obelix and the old Gaul from seeing them when I was growing up. And I do agree that it is more of a closer in the same vein of the Looney Tunes, where we have these characters that aren't necessarily the they have the biggest numbers, let's say, fighting the Romans, but they have this portion that gives them super strength. But besides that, it also Asterix is also trying to outsmart his opponents when he can't just brute force his way out to of them. And there's it's very much just a comedy animated movie, and it is something that I would recommend watching, as they have said, watching it with family, the kids. And I do think let's say the most intelligent joke in it will be the bureaucratic building sequence. That is definitely a bit more of a commentary about the bureaucracy and all the cumbersomeness of the process that we have to follow sometimes to get something so simple. I think it was also nice the moment when they get to this Love Island and they basically move out of there because Obelix is in Obelix's main passion is in the island, so he's like he won't really stop there just for the women. He's the kind of guy that will probably be happier in a place where they will serve him food until the end of days. And yeah, no, I'm very very fond of Asterix. I do agree that the animation is also not as amazing as perhaps not to compare it with something closer in the French. It is a standard style of drawing, we'll say it, and we recently just came out from what we just finished watching this week Fantastic Planet from René Laloux. The animation style of it is certainly different, but perhaps closer to the short skits that you will see in a Monty Python episode. And that one is a lot more striking and probably memorable, but I would still recommend Asterix as a watch sometime in your life.
Well, I think as far as characters, it's very reminiscent of Looney Tunes, but I think his animation style is very reminiscent of Hanna-Barbera cartoons. That not only that, but it's also that same dated style that kind of has showed its age now compared to more modern animated films and animated shows in general.
Yeah, I understand that the 70s and 80s were kind of a tough era for American animations. Like, you can bring up the example of Hanna-Barbera. In fact, they would had use a lot of different cost-cutting techniques in their cartoons. In that era, basically barely had any movement in them. So I think Asterix might even come out a little better in comparison. And I would kind of like to speak to this comparison of the styles in Fantastic Planet and this. I don't begrudge Asterix for the art style they used, because the advantage to something like this with a more simple line drawings of the characters in comparison to Fantastic Planet, which has a lot of visible pencil shading and things like that, is that it's easier to have a lot of movement in it. So if Asterix had gone for that bigger style, it would have been very stiff and it wouldn't have been able to have the kind of exaggeration and movement that's necessary for a comedy of this style. I think we do see that in Fantastic Planet, where there can be a lot of very still frames and not too much movement in quite a bit of the film overall.
Yes, I would say probably to sum up the comparison of both is that Fantastic Planet would be more artistic in its animation, whereas Asterix is more focused on the animation itself and less about the art.
Indeed, yeah, that's what I will agree with. And well, coming back to it, I think we had mentioned that part of the themes of Asterix is also like the French versus the Italians, something that is apparently still ongoing to a certain
Yes,
extent.
even today. Whether you're talking about football or soccer for those American audience members that might be listening, or just geopolitical tensions in general, both historic and current. Yes, it very much is the French essentially taking the piss on Italians at their expense, of course.
Although in a rather like, I can't imagine being very upset by this if I was an Italian, because it definitely feels like the French trying to console themselves for their very obvious loss during this period of history.
Yes, I mean the only type of person I could think of maybe getting irritated by this would be your very kind of Mussolini fascist type who
Yeah.
gets irritated by anything when their country is criticized.
Although, Wally, you might know a little bit more about this. Comparison is also a little bit distanced by the fact that there's not even really a direct ancestry between the people who occupied France, like the Gauls occupying France, and the modern French nation, really. Because I think a lot more of it descends from the empire that Charlemagne and his company made.
Correct.
After the
Yes.
fall of the
So
Western Roman Empire.
this is definitely kind of this pseudo nationalism that I think is played. That the fact that a modern Frenchman claims that they were in fact Gaulish is a bit absurd, because the Gauls themselves were more Celtic in origin rather than French. And as you said, modern France is basically found on Charlemagne's empire, which in fact was founded by the Franks, who are a Germanic tribe, which many modern French might not want to admit to. But
Yeah.
Would you still say that regarding Asterix, the French people are weird then? Uh,
Well,
Geopolitics?
much less so than either of the other French animations I've seen so far. I'll say that.
well, I mean, it definitely seems to be the sort of sour grapes that tends to come in, at least with this show. The fact because of the fact that, as we had mentioned, the Gauls had gotten conquered by the Romans. The French in general had been conquered by both the later or the earlier German Empire and then later the Nazi Empire. And so this is kind of this. I think Exdeath, you had used the phrase "licking their wounds" a bit, and kind of to puff themselves up to feel better.
Yeah, that's how it comes off to me. I don't know how Italians feel about it, but if I were one of them, I kind of just laugh at it, I think.
I mean, there is this also like ongoing trend, at least in that decade, I feel, of mocking the French too. They're in Monty Python and the Holy Grail does this when the Crusaders are facing the French, and they're always mocking them, and they can't even manage to storm the castle that they have, and
Well, yes, during the 70s, there was very much this mocking of both French and German kind of bureaucratic. I guess the modern example today would be a lot of anti-EU sentiment, basically agitated towards Brussels, whereas during this time period, it was very much agitated towards France and Germany, because the EU at this time was still relatively small. In fact, I'm not even sure if it was technically considered the European Union. I'd have to check my history. I think it was still the whatever the trade league was called, where it was essentially just Western Europe.
I think
Yeah,
it wasn't as consolidated because they were still using, well, at least the countries that were part of it, they were still using their own coin, and then today the unified euro.
Yeah, so I think this example from Monty Python kind of just serves to demonstrate that the relationship between Britain and France is similar to the relationship between France and Italy to a certain extent, where they'll sort of playfully mock each other in films and stuff like that. With the case of Britain and France specifically, I think how it's worked is kind of that they've had a lot of conflict in history, but in more recent memories, the last 200 years, maybe a little less, they've mostly been allies, so their relationship is maybe a little bit warmer overall.
Yes, kind of a sense of mocking what you love or at least admire, sort of poking at, I would assume.
Yeah, England and Scotland, I think, have a bit of a similar relationship these days. We'll make fun of each other, but there's not really much genuine animosity between English people and Scots, as far as I know.
I would say Scots and as well as Welsh, and then
Yes.
even to a lesser extent, although who knows now with the political climate, but England and Ireland.
Yeah, well, I think the Irish have more reason to be upset overall, though the Scots do as well, because the English have persecuted both of them a lot throughout history.
Well, there's also then the group of people that don't really make any difference between all of the regions in the United Kingdom, and they're all British then.
Right.
But yeah, that's I think there's this tendency in them. And going back to Asterix, one of the reasons why I like Asterix a lot is what we mentioned, that there's this. Well, the film even makes this comment that Asterix is the smartest of them, and we have this hero that is in at least Asterix himself is in conventionally like a conventionally attractive heroes. He's actually, I think, the smallest of all the Gaul. It's like even when compared to Obelix, he's just he looks like a dwarf kind of. And but even then, Asterix does make up for it for his wit and outsmarting his opponents. And I like it when even in a cartoon like that, the character himself isn't just brute forcing his way through, but rather using his brain to and his resources to get the most out of a situation.
Yeah, I think something worth commenting on is that Asterix gets this magic potion that lets him have like super strength and speed and things like that, and he uses it to overcome the first trial, which is a race against a very fast marathon runner. But he gets through the vast majority of the rest of the trials without using it.
Indeed, his uses of them are actually, I think you could count them in a single hand, despite the fact that they were 12 tasks. So simulating the 12 tasks that Heracles completed.
That's actually interesting to comment on, because I found that, at least as far as if I'm looking at this through a sort of nationalistic lens, the fact that even though Asterix might be intelligent and might kind of logically solve his way through some of these puzzles, his crutch is if he gets into a corner or is backed into a corner, he relies on the potion, as do all of the Gauls in general in this little village, which I don't know if that speaks to maybe the French idea of superiority at all, or if maybe it's more just tongue-in-cheek that the creators of the show and the movie just don't take themselves that seriously as far as having it be a take that to the Italians.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't try to read into it too much with regards to symbolism and stuff like that. I think it's mostly a playful mocking of the Italians.
Yeah, I would consider the same too. Just humoristic take, and no more to it. Well, another one of the facts too is that also, even though Asterix is the main hero, Obelix still takes a lot of the. Some of the tasks are basically him taking the lead. The most obvious one being the buffet, where he has this endless appetite, and it just keeps on eating plate after plate of the insane kinds of food that he's been given. But even then, as coming back to what I had mentioned about the Love Island, even though Asterix is a bit more intolerant, Obelix just snaps out of it when he's like, "What? Well, you can give me anything that I want, right? So you can give me food and this." And then the women just recoil at having to cook for him and such, and he's like, well, if there's no food, then I'm out of here. That's and I like that moment really, when he's not bound by what you would say the usual.
Well, yeah, it's a very classic trope in at least more cartoonish sorts of shows or movies. The brain and the brawn sidekicks were, in more American terms, the Abbott and Costello type of pairing, and I think that very much is shown in this series and movie as well.
Yeah, and if we compare Asterix to Bugs Bunny, we can compare Obelix to someone like Goofy, who has what I not so politically correctly called cartoon retard powers, where whatever difficult situation presents itself, he'll kind of happen to stumble through them through his like oblivious cluelessness, and that's kind of what happens on the island. He doesn't outsmart that problem, right? And he just kind of happens to have the right priorities if he gets away from it.
Indeed, it does fit in also with his character that he is more of a food guy. He's not a Casanova, let's say.
Yes.
And well, as I mentioned, Asterix in the 12 Stacks is actually one of like the later movies. Let's say, I believe it's actually the last one that René Godinsky works on, because he passed away a year later in 1977. So after that, Uderzo took over the mantle of the creator, of this sole creator basically of Asterix, of writing and illustrating. So there are a few other movies that precede this one. So it's what I meant, that if you had seen the others, then you would understand that. Well, you don't need to understand, but you can see that the fact that Asterix and Obelix retain their characteristics, and it even does a reference at the end when Caesar just ends up conceding the victory to the Gauls, and he ends up retiring with Cleopatra, which is a reference to the Asterix and Cleopatra film before it. So it is nice to see these the ongoing characteristics of them.
Yeah, and this franchise is also continued into the present. Like, there's a computer animated one that came out in 2018.
Yeah, there are. I haven't seen that one actually yet, but I'd say. Yeah, I don't think I've seen any of the Asterix movies except a live action one with Gerard Depardieu that I think came out like in 2001 or 2.
Yeah, you love him.
I think it was 1999, because this is actually something I did read up on. And going back to sort of the French ego, there was a period where when this came out, the French in general were hoping that this would quote unquote dethrone Titanic, which was the movie that came out the same year, and was basically this puffing up their chest, saying how French cinema was superior to American cinema because the film itself was better than Titanic, and this sort of hubristic attitude where I think if you were to compare both of them, now I'm not a huge Titanic fan to begin with, but I would definitely say that the French were probably in the wrong in this regard, or at least were. I don't know if they've changed their attitude since then, but
So are you talking about the movie Asterix and Obelix Take on Caesar from 1999?
whatever the live action one was, yes.
There are actually more than one, but the one I meant, it's actually the one that's Mission Cleopatra, which comes out in 2002. But if you are referring to the Take on Caesar, then it's probably that one, that Titanic.
Yeah, I think at least from a pure technical standpoint, Titanic is probably a lot more impressive out of the two.
But that, I guess, points to, even though this is a sort of tongue-in-cheek show, how serious at least some French people do take at least their kind of cultural things.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about, how something that seems to begin as something kind of trivial, just almost past the time, can evolve to have this seemingly excessive consequence just from people's mindset.
I should also note too that it was during the late 90s that the relationship between France and the US was prickly at best, so that also might have played a part into the whole attitude at the time.
Yeah, well, they were also coming with I think that if we take the year 1999, the French were coming with the high of having just won the World Cup in France '98. So they had a lot to carry on that hubris, as you mentioned.
Well, I've heard a lot of people kind of complain about American cinema as being, I guess you could say, artless and very commercial in contrast to foreign cinema. So you would think that the French would take that angle if they wanted to stick up their noses, instead of trying to directly outcompete them on the money and technical scale.
Well, hubris is a dangerous thing, as the Greeks forewarned centuries ago.
Indeed. Well, I mean, if I don't, sadly not aware of anything that I could say that has been influenced by Asterix. So at least Asterix himself does keep living up today. There are, you will just mention the CG animated movie that came out in 2018. I've yet to see that one to properly comment on it, but it is nice to see that at least in terms of the crucial, they keep on living some of the older cartoons, which is something that at least I mean, I also grew up watching Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera cartoons, and I feel that with them, they these kind of cartoons and their spirits have been like they come and go. Sometimes they like there's this revival for a new Looney Tunes shows, and it seems that it doesn't get enough traction, and then it just continues. It's discontinued, and then comes a new reboot, and so and so. But it the only one that I may be living on in a way, I think, will be Mickey Mouse, who, as a friend of us may say, is better than Donkey Kong too in the video games.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess the one thing that we can take from this is the fact that even outside the US, there is this desire to have not new animation, just having some kind of animation as opposed to the very live action CGI heavy sort of productions that seem to be at least common in the US market.
Indeed. Yeah, the French do have the I think when does the Lady and the Pigeon movie came out, Apotex?
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to look it up.
I think that was not too old, right?
Sorry?
I think that was not too old, right? Like compared with Asterix.
I think it's newer than that, yeah. It's a small scale project. You have one director. At first, I thought it was just done by one guy, but it's definitely not. It's done by a larger team. Okay, it's 1997 for this, and it's by Sylvain Chomet. He's done quite a few other animated films, with two of the notable ones being The Illusionist and The Triplets of Belleville, which came out in 2003.
Right, so that by that time, I think this Disney was still releasing some animated, 2D animated movies. So
Yeah, The Princess and the Frog, I think, is their last theatrical 2D one. That was like 2009 or something. In the early 2000s is the era of the direct-to-video Disney sequel. So there's kind of one of their dark eras.
yeah, but that's still like a decade away. I feel that would there have been other 2D animated movies that have come out in the past decade that may have been French, but I just can't recall the name right now. I know I haven't seen. And
I wouldn't know. When it comes to carrying the torch on 2D animation, Japan is obviously the country to look at, with most anime still more or less being done 2D.
Well, there was a movie, I think it was in the late aughts. This is actually one I mentioned to both you guys, was Renaissance, which was a French animated film. It came out the same year as Sin City. It had the same sort of art style, which I think is part of the reason it kind of flopped, is because it was competing against that. And Sin City, being an American production, obviously had more broader appeal and more widespread distribution.
Yeah, and also name recognition to a certain extent, based on a classic comic by Frank Miller.
Right.
But yeah, this at least, yeah, when we talk about who is still doing French, but I'm sorry, French 2D animated movies to date, and with great output, will be Japan, definitely. At least top of the head, my head, I can't think about any other one that. But yeah, this.
Yeah, you'd mostly be looking at smaller scale or indie projects. Like 2D animation does survive on TV in America. Look at something like Gravity Falls, Adventure Time, or any of those.
Indeed.
And small scale projects on the internet and stuff. Gorillaz is actually another example from the UK. The virtual band, they still do use a lot of 2D animation in their music videos.
Yeah, Gorillaz is. Yeah, no, that's a different example, but a good one. They say when in terms of music, they have they haven't just been 2D only, but most of their videos embrace that, and it's really nice in that sense, because that there are a lot of music videos that after I think some of the better ones that have used 2D animation on them.
For Gorillas, yeah, like Feel Good Inc., which is their most well-known one, uses some 2D animation.
Indeed. Well, yeah, no, I'd say just hoping that more studios from this side of the world. I mean, not that I don't like the Japanese one because I love them too, but do notice that 2D animation shouldn't die at all. There are still a lot of good gems that could come out of them, rather than just releasing direct-to-video movies that are sometimes lacking, sadly.
Yeah, I would love to see a revival of the traditional hand-drawn animation in big-scale theatrical projects. I love that stuff.
Well, I don't know if we have anything else to say then about Asterix. I think.
No.
I'm good.
Yep.
Well, thank you for listening to us and see you next time.